Chapter 13, South. The last of the horses had gone from the stables, and already the living rooms had been stripped of furniture. Decimus stood in the middle of the courtyard roaring orders, while Fulvius saw personally to the packing of the best mess plate and the Corinthian cups. Philo was still at his desk, but already wearing his traveling cloak and the new, heavy sandals that the tribune had given him. Galenus swirled in his helmet and red cloak. "Stop that now, however far you've got. I want you down at the barracks to check the mule loads. The man there's useless. 5 minutes to say goodbye to the old lady." Philo rolled up the lists he had been checking and stuffed them in his wallet with his writing materials. Suddenly he thought he was going to be sick, but there wasn't time. No time for anything more. He ran through to the storeyard. Conan was there talking to his friend Quintus. He recognized the look on his brother's face. "You're off? I'll get everyone." It was completely unreal, hugging Hylas and the tearful Lucia. "Don't go on so," said Conan. "He's not going to fight. He'll be back before the end of summer. I'll see him off." That was easier, walking back through the archway and down the steps for the last time, with only Conan to think about, not yet realizing that he had seen the others for the last time, as now, in this unlooked-for way, he was at last following his father south on the journey he had dreamed of all his life beyond the desert gate. "Hylas told me some of what he told you before I came," said Conan. "I don't know yet what would be best for Lucia when he goes. Perhaps Uncle Menelaus would take her. I've got a few more days to work something out, and Hylas won't leave her till she's settled." "You don't mean he might go before I come back?" That had never occurred to Philo. "No, I don't think so, but who can tell? You won't be away long. You haven't enlisted, and you can come home when you like." "I suppose so. I hadn't thought of it like that." Decimus shouted at him. Conan put an arm around his shoulders and gave him a quick hug. "We'll see each other again. After Jerusalem, I'll see you." Galenus rode past the gate on his white horse, and Philo followed behind him, his bundle on his back, and with the last of the mess servants. When he reached the main barracks, there was no time to think about himself. The 2 sentries who had been stationed there would march out within the hour, and Philo found himself for the first time in the middle of the ordered chaos of any group of soldiers about to move. For a moment he was frightened. Then Fulvius found him, told him what he wanted and where to go, and when the first trumpet sounded, he slung his pack into the mess wagon and went off to check the mules. They left before midday. It was a short 2 days' march south to Machaerus. Riding through the market on the tail of the wagon, Philo wondered if he could see Conan. But his brother had much to do if he was to see things settled before he went. It was one of the first warm days. Philo leaned back comfortably against the baggage, feeling the relief that leaving Conan in charge had brought him. He supposed he had been stupid not to have realized that he might be needed when the troops marched south, but he had always expected to be left behind with the problems. He understood now a little bit of what Conan had felt when he marched north to enlist. The wagon with men marching ahead and behind creaked out of the market and under the steep western slope of the citadel. The heavy sandals made the steady pulse-like beat that they heard so long ago when the tribune came to Philadelphia. He looked up for the first time to the high line of the walls and the corner of the temple roof that showed from there, and thought that his father must have looked up from the same place each time he went south. Then they were through the gate, first among olive groves, climbing the steep slopes of the hills above the road, and then out onto the high plateau, among cornfields and pasture. The road swung south, leaving the pass down to the river and the great Rift Valley to the west. They came to Machaerus on the evening of the second day. Since noon, a hamsin had been blowing and the air was hot and full of sand. Philo had been stiff enough to get out of the wagon and walk part of the way, a fold of his cloak protecting his face. He was very tired and parched dry all over. Late in the afternoon, they had turned down the road that led to Machaerus. With a sick fascination, he realized this must be where his father had found Hylas. He looked down at the baked, rocky ground with its covering of blown sand and pebbles and tried to think how it would have been to lie there the year before in the full sun. He was glad that for once it was veiled. The pass wound down a long way, crossing from side to side of an ever-deepening gorge, till they came on Machaerus suddenly at a turn in the road. There was a hold-up ahead, and the wagon was halted so that he sat for some time looking across at the place where Nicanor had chosen to live. It was not how he had imagined it, an isolated fort, more a small city built on a smooth-sided anvil of rock that rose high above deep gorges in a slope from east to west. On that side the rock rose sheer for hundreds of feet above the pass that wound out through foothills to the lake beyond. The sun had dipped behind the high, level line of the cliffs on the far side of the lake, so that the citadel had crowned the walls of the city was drawn against the sky like a dark fang. Up there, a few lights were burning already, and there were more in the town, but all lay very quiet under a menacing sky. A galloper reined in his horse beside the wagon and called over to Fulvius, "Officers' quarters, over to the right, below the White Rock." Fulvius pulled the wagon off the road and made for a line of tents which had already been pitched. There were horse lines further down the slope, and, beneath the menace of those dark walls, the shouting of men caring for animals in an unfamiliar place in the dark. The ground was trampled and strewn with rubbish. Fulvius snorted. "Smell that? You can tell it's an auxiliary camp. Who's in charge here? He must have let his men live like pigs. Galenus will soon have it set to rights, and the perimeter enlarged, though no one could expect a properly laid-out camp in this broken ground." "Will anyone want me tonight?" asked Philo suddenly, frightened again by the noise and darkness. "No, find yourself somewhere to sleep. You could do worse than a corner of headquarters tent. At least that'll be fairly clean." The long leather tent was already up with its awning facing west across the saddle of land that divided the wall down from the camp. The tribune's orderly was fixing up the trestle table that held maps or food according to need. Towards the back, a small curtained-off area already held Galenus's camp bed. Boxes and equipment were piled untidily at the sides. Philo supposed that he was hungry, but he was too tired to search for food. He found a dark corner behind the baggage, curled up in his cloak, and lay down. It was a long time before he slept. The ground was hard, and the coming and going went on until late. At first he lay rigid, afraid that one of the servants would move the boxes that sheltered him, but they did not, and at last he fell asleep. They came to Machaerus at the beginning of summer. It was a month later that, looking out through the shimmering heat down the valley from under the tent awning, Philo saw the smoke in the sky that Hylas had imagined on the day before he left Philadelphia. The tribune heard him gasp and came out to stand beside him, looking above the heat haze over the distant lake to the west. "Yes, that must be it. Jerusalem has gone at last. Nothing but a whole city could make the sky look like that. Jupiter Ammon, I'm glad I'm not there now. There's no glory in a massacre, and in that city it'll be like scything a cornfield." Philo found that tears were running down his cheeks for the city he had never seen. "What's that for?" asked Galenus. "You aren't a Jew?" Philo gulped hard and wiped his nose. "Of course, your brother's there. Well, perhaps now it's over and at last and we can close our first round this place and make an end here too. That's if Titus sends us the men to do it. I can stop supplies getting in any quantity, but with 200 men I can't do more." So it was going to begin in earnest. Philo looked across at Machaerus. It was still possible to get into the lower town, where a miserable collection of Syrians, Greeks, and refugees lived. He had asked Fulvius why they were there when they knew that sooner or later the citadel would be captured. "Where else can they go?" Fulvius pointed west across the great valley. "Look what they've escaped from. Can they go back to Jerusalem?" It would not be long now. The legions would come, and that would be the end of it. Was Nicanor still there? The tribune was not busy, although it was clear that would soon change. On the afternoon after the burning of the city, Philo escaped from the tent and went down the track that led through the camp gate and into the town below the citadel. It was blazing hot. The sun pressed like a weight on his head, and the heat was reflected back from the sides of the valley. The men at the Roman guard post on the road were half asleep. They had no instructions to stop civilians, not obviously carrying stores, and the men were bored. Philo got through with no more than some rude remarks from the decurion, who recognized him. Between the whitewashed walls of the houses it was cooler. Flights of steps and narrow streets snaked upwards, back and forth across the steep slope up to the entrance of the citadel. A few old men sat in the deeper patches of shadow. Behind a high window a fretful baby cried. Otherwise it was quiet. Philo climbed until he reached a wider open space close beneath the upper walls. He began to wish he had not come. What was he going to do? Call up to the Jewish guards moving about the gate, dark against the intense blue of the sky, and ask if his brother was there and would come out and talk to him? That would only get him an arrow between the shoulders. Nicanor must be in there somewhere, and he would probably never have the chance to be so near him again, and yet there was nothing he could do about it. He squatted down in a patch of shade to watch in the hope that some better idea might come. He had been there an hour. The sun had passed behind the top of the citadel, and the streets behind had begun to come out to life, when from below he heard marching feet. The men on the wall heard them too, and could see something. A shout brought an officer to peer down and call an order over the shoulder. Philo stood up and ran a few paces back down the alley. Now he wanted to get away without being seen, but in the unfamiliar maze of streets he knew he would soon lose himself. The marching squad stopped. It was only an armed patrol, but he recognized the tall plume of Galenus' helmet, and two of the other officers came to spy out the land. They kept well back in the cover of the buildings while the guard fanned out, taking what shelter they could. A man Philo knew, a big red-haired regular, almost fell over him, coming up from behind to guard the alley. "What are you doing here? Hop it! The Tribune will slaughter you if he finds you up here sightseeing." Philo knew he was right, grinned sheepishly, and had turned to go when there was a sudden unfamiliar sound. Very close, a whoosh and a thud. A heavy weight hit him between the shoulders and slid down his side to the ground. Philo jumped clear and turned. It was the soldier lying on his side, his legs kicking while the shaft of an arrow struck out of his back at a sharp angle. Philo saw the froth of blood on his lips, knew there was nothing he could do, and started running. From behind there were shouts, a scream, heavy footfalls, and the grinding of a great gate. His feet found a way down the hill, though through narrow streets suddenly empty again as doors slammed and the few thin children were snatched up and pulled to safety. He was nearly out in the open before he stopped to get his breath. The sound of fighting still came from up near the citadel, but it did not seem to be spreading. Trumpets sounded across the slope in the camp, and reinforcements clattered past. Waiting his chance to get back, he realized it was not a general attack, only a Jewish commander taking the opportunity to make trouble. Romans began to come back down the road, two supporting a wounded man, another carried on a hurdle, then a more ordered tramping as if Galenus had withdrawn most of his men in some sort of order. Philo made a dash for it, dodging through the guard post and up between the barracks tents. He got there first, but not by much, and before he had caught his breath, the tribune and two centurions came in after him. Galenus gave the last of a string of orders over his shoulder, switched to a comprehensive list of oaths without drawing breath, and threw his helmet at his servant. He stood there, big, hot, and furiously angry, his cloak slashed by a sword cut, and blood spattered on one leg, rubbing a grazed elbow. Then he turned on Philo. "Don't just stand there!" Philo sat down at his table, shaking, but before he could pick up his stylus, a great hand plucked him off his stool again and turned him toward the light. "What's that on your tunic?" It was the back he was looking at. Philo did not know. He wiggled his shoulders and it felt stiff. It must be blood from the dying soldier. He began to feel sick. "You're hurt?" "No, sir, it isn't mine." Galenus caught hold of one shoulder of the tunic and tore it away. Philo's back was unmarked. "You were up there in the city. Why? Who sent you?" He spun him around and shook the boy so that he could hardly speak. "No one. I only went to look." Surprisingly, the tribune believed him. "Understand, you do not leave this camp again without permission." He flung the boy away so that he caught hold of one of the tent poles to prevent him from falling against the camp table. Then, as he hung there, he felt the first blow. Galenus had picked up the nearest weapon which had come to hand, his ceremonial cane. It could have been a riding whip, but this was bad enough. Philo had never been beaten like that before, by a strong and angry man. The pain was worse than anything he had ever imagined, as if all his ribs were breaking. Still clinging to the pole, he slid to his knees. Above his own sobbing breath and the roaring in his head, he heard other voices shouting outside. Someone said loudly, "Dispatches, sir!" The blows stopped. He knelt there, too dazed to move, till another hand caught him by the arm and pulled him up through the rear of the tent and out of the side entrance the servants used. It was Fulvius. He dropped the boy in a heap while he pulled the flap to behind him. "You little fool! Couldn't you see he'd turn on the first person to get in his way? If Galenus gets caught in an ambush, someone else is going to suffer for it. Let's have a look. Not too bad. Lucky he was interrupted. It's mainly bruising. Have you got another tunic?" But Philo was beyond answering. He crouched in the shadow of the tent while Fulvius did what he could for his back, and found him a whole tunic. "Now keep out of sight for as long as you can, but he may shout for you, and then you'll have to go. Of course you can. You'll feel better in an hour. Come round and lie on my bed." He helped Philo to his feet. "At least you didn't yell." Did Hylas yell? Thought Philo, as he eased himself down on Fulvius's palliacy. And Galenus had only been cross. He hadn't really been trying to hurt him. Only then, when his face was safely hidden, could he let himself cry, and it was as much for the brother he would never see again now as for his own pain.